You are listening to Action Design, your monthly insight into the field of behavioral economics and its applications to the world around us. We bring you leading practitioners from all industries to discuss cutting-edge behavioral research and how to practically apply those concepts to the development of consumer products and public policy.
Well, hello everyone. Welcome to another episode of Action Design Radio. This is Erik Johnson, joined as always with my host, Zarak Khan.
Hello.
Zarak, are there any unique animals being walked around the park outside this time or no?
Sadly, no. I did see the pig come back. I learned that his name is Mr. Wiggly.
Amazing.
That was absolutely the highlight of last week. No, this
Spoiler alert, Mr. Wiggly will be one of our future guests. So.
There's some ducks in the duck pond, and there's some bunnies in my backyard.
Wow.
Yeah. I spend a good probably 90 minutes now during quarantine just watching bunnies in my backyard running around. So
lots of nature. That's good.
That's right.
Good. Keeps you sane while you're inside, I guess. The most nature I've seen today is some pigeons that were in our backyard, so not quite as exciting.
Sorry.
But anyway, we're excited to have our guest on today. We have Matt Darling from Ideas 42 joining us to talk about some more coronavirus-related topics. We're going to talk a little bit more about specifics around kind of the economics of the situation and kind of where behavioral science can and cannot influence what's going on. But first, Matt, welcome to the show. Thank you for joining us. Why don't you give the audience a little bit of an introduction to yourself and what you work on and all that kind of stuff.
Great. Thanks for having me on. And always good to see you, Erik, and nice meeting you, Zarak. So I work at Ideas 42, which is a firm that does behavioral economics and behavioral science consulting. And we're a nonprofit, so we do work on sort of how to solve big, important social problems using behavioral science as one of the tools. And I've been at Ideas 42 the entire time Ideas 42 has existed. I think we started in about 2010. So I've been there for 10 years now. In that context, I've worked in a lot of different domains. So I've done stuff on getting people to reduce energy use. I've done stuff on getting people to take up diabetes prevention training. I've done work on getting people to use less water. But I think most of the work I've done has been focused on domestic poverty. And broadly, that's thinking about how do we redesign the social safety net and different types of programs and policies, given what we know about behavioral economics. And that is definitely an issue that is becoming more and more relevant right now.
Somewhat topical, to say the least.
Exactly.
So yeah, I think that's a good transition to our first topic. I think we first want to cover, like I said, your work's been kind of all in a broad range of areas in the behavioral economics space, but your formal background, I believe, is more in economics, and you've also, like you said, focused a lot on economics and poverty, things like that. So maybe give us a little bit of an overview of how you and your work is kind of seeing everything that's going on in this relatively unique situation that's going on economically. We're in sort of uncharted waters in many ways. We've obviously been through recessions before, but this one's a little bit different. So
yeah,
give us a little bit of a background of how you've been viewing things that are going on, what sort of a behavioral economics perspective is on that, and even from a kind of core labor economics perspective, just how you even think about it and what type of things we should be considering.
Totally. And I want to start talking about it from a conventional economics perspective, and then we'll incorporate some behavioral stuff as we go.
Sounds good.
But I think for me, like I mentioned, like I started working at Ideas 42 in 2010, which is of course right after the last recession, right? Which is where I sort of hid in my master's program then. So it was kind of a fun time to be basically like learning macroeconomics, and then from the courses in the textbooks, and then also learning macroeconomics from the news.
Yeah.
And and it's one of those things where this event and the previous event are just much bigger than anything since the Great Depression, and it's so hard for us to sort of recognize that in terms of just like really odd times. And and I think one of the interesting things about this right now is that in 2008, like there's sort of like a lot of knowledge that people have forgotten about macroeconomics because they're just sort of like, oh, like what do you do during a recession? Like, oh, well, the Federal Reserve cuts interest rates a little bit and then everything's fine. And it's sort of interesting because they had to relearn a lot of stuff coming out of the Great Depression. And now it's like, oh, we actually have a bunch of macroeconomists who've thought about these issues in the last decade and been working on it. But I mean, just to give a bit of context for today they announced the new number of people who filed for unemployment claims, which was almost 6 million. The previous record was 3 million, which was set last week. The previous record before that was like 100,000 or something like that. I don't remember the exact numbers, but like we're just sort of seeing a huge amount of people out of work, struggling to do that. And just to maybe start trying to connect this into like a lot of the stuff that I've been thinking about in the last couple of years has been poverty programs and how our anti-poverty programs are designed and how they could be designed better. And one of the things I'll just sort of start with is that no one sort of understands our anti-poverty programs. They're really complicated because of different departments running them. So you have SNAP being run by agriculture and other things being run by Health and Human Services. Then everything, of course, is run by the states. You have millions of anti-poverty programs in the United States. But I think one of the things that I've been thinking about the most is sort of like administrative burdens that you have to do to actually get programs, right? So it's a lot of the time it's getting unemployment insurance. You normally have to spend a couple of weeks where people are going and checking, okay, how did this person actually get this information? What was this person? Are we sure that this person was laid off versus quit? And those sort of administrative burdens are always pretty bad, but they're especially bad right now when there's 6 million people waiting to receive their unemployment checks.
Yeah, so I mean, it's in some difference, like a lot of the things that you've probably been researching and looking at from these perspectives are probably just exacerbated by the situation. I think that's probably true for a lot of things going on, and that kind of existing issues or existing inequalities, whatever that is, are sort of just like really magnified by what's going on. So maybe we can talk about that a little bit more. Like, there's a lot of confusion in the system, not necessarily the most user-friendly interfaces to work with, things like that. What are some of those things that have been more coming up in your past research, and how might those be even more magnified by the record numbers of employment, things that we have going on?
So like I spent a lot of time last year thinking about work requirements for Medicaid, right? So Medicaid is it's a health insurance program for people who are low income. And at some point, people said, hey, what we should start doing is we should say, if you're getting Medicaid, you should be working, right? And so you should be either, have a job where you're working at least a few hours a week, or you should be able to like demonstrate that you have been looking for work. And, the way this ends up being a lot of times is something like, if you're requiring that people demonstrate that they are looking for work, which also like unemployment insurance does, other things look at, like it is something where you might go and say, okay, every 2 weeks you have to fill out a form either online or actually in person that says like, these are the 3 places I have looked for a job. And these systems, there's one part of it which is like, okay, how do people actually like look for work, which I think I don't want to get right now, but like a lot of it is almost like it's written for like a 1970s version of the workplace where, the way you looked for work is you went to businesses, you knocked on their doors and you said, hey, how's it going? You guys have a job. And
wearing bell bottoms likely. Yeah,
exactly. And you think, well, like, okay, how do people look for work now? And like, the way I've looked for work is I say, okay, I go to, monster.com and I set up a little like automatic thing that finds the jobs that, fit certain criteria that I said, and that emails me every week. And I'm like, how do I even document some of these things? Or is it even worth documenting? But it is like, what it is, it creates this like administrative burden where you have to do all these like tiny annoying things. And I think one thing that comes out of behavioral science very much is like these tiny annoying things have this huge amount of, they're much more effective than you think they would be. So I have, there's some example that I'll sometimes use is that people who haven't been through anti-poverty programs are more familiar with is like, getting reimbursed for something, right? So like if I'm invited to go to a conference by somebody and they say, this is great, like we're going to reimburse you on this, you just send us your the name of the hotel, and when you eat, like keep your receipts and everything like that, and totally makes sense. And I'm like, okay, great. And I always sign up for it. I'm like, that's fine. And then I come back after that. I'm like, oh well, I don't really feel like going and capturing all my receipts right now. And then like 2 months pass, and I'm like, oh wait, like am I owed like $1,000 by this group that paid for me to go out, hypothetically is paying for me to do this?
A very familiar feeling for me, I know.
Yeah. And like, some of the stuff I can find out, I can go and find, the hotel information, or the flight information, but like, I never store my receipts for any accuracy. And just like, so I'm like, oh yeah, like every time I go out, I lose like $100 or something like that of meals that, hypothetically be paid by someone else. And like, a lot of that is because I'm at this juncture where like, maybe I'm lucky enough that like, I'm not desperate for that $100. But if you're a person in poverty, if you're a person who is at that margin, like I think a lot of the sort of mental model that folks have is that you're like, when you put up these administrative burdens, when you put up these paperwork burdens on these systems, is that what it's going to do is it's going to filter the people who really need the programs from the people who don't really need it. With the so it's like, oh, if you can go and do this, like that means you really need this $500 a month or whatever. And I think the more you know about behavioral science, the more the exact opposite is true, right? Is that if you are a person who is experiencing poverty, who is sort of very, very cash poor, very liquidity constrained, trying to figure out where your next meal is coming from, where your next rent check is going to come from, the last thing you're going to do is spend 6 hours like navigating some website trying to find out what form to fill out. It's just something you don't have the luxury of doing. And so a lot of our programs are designed almost backwards, like from that.
Yeah, I've seen a couple things lately of like people identifying or highlighting these administrative burdens that have been lifted. In particular, things that are now, it's almost like a safety is like the argument, right? Where it's like, oh, you had to come in person and sort of prove that you're doing these things, and now maybe you don't even have to do that at all, or at the very least, it's virtual, which I think is great. Obviously, I think that it's interesting to get maybe your perspective on the different tools that are available, because you have kind of formal training and also just experience and exposure to not just sort of behavioral interventions and sort of behavioral science tools, but also kind of these bigger mechanisms to drive behavior. So how are you kind of thinking about that in this current context of the balance between those things?
Yeah. So I'll give an example. So like one of the things that people are thinking about a lot right now, especially after the big UI claims I mentioned earlier, is so in the CARES Act. So for people who are watching this, like when it's not in the future where like everything's different as everything is changing every 3 days. But like one of the things that was happened in the bill passed last week, like 6 days ago, is they said, hey, what we're going to do is we're going to reform unemployment insurance for the next 3 months. And they made a whole bunch of changes, but I'm going to point out 2 of them. The first one is that they said, whatever you were normally getting for unemployment insurance, add $600. The reason they're adding $600 as opposed to just like saying, hey, make it twice as generous, is that all the UI code was written in 1965 and no one actually knows how to do the make everyone get paid their original wages. So that's one piece. The second piece is that, again, normally you have to, they have to be like, okay, did you get laid off, or did you get fired for cause, or did you quit? And like those are, they're sort of philosophical disputes, right? If I sort of am a bad worker and my company lays off people, like I'll be the first person laid off. I might have done that consciously trying to get them to lay me off. But what they've actually said in the language of the act is that you have to self-certify as someone who has become unemployed because of COVID. And I'm super interested in what self-certify ends up meaning. But like to your point, Zarak, it's sort of interesting because like right now, and we'll see how like the guidance comes out of this, but like right now, you basically can kind of the reading I have is like, you can basically go to the unemployment insurance and basically say, hey, I am now unemployed because my job shut down, or I had to take care of a family member or anything like that. And they're just going to trust you. And, we'll see how that actually lays out, but that's like what the statute says as of right now. And I'm super interested in that because, one of the points that I sometimes raise in these kinds of conversations is like, we kind of should just trust people a little bit more, in terms of like doing all this documentation does two things, right? Like, one, it's super annoying so people don't do it. And two, it's actually like puts you in this mindset where you actually are saying, oh, like the government doesn't trust me, so I don't trust the government, so who cares? So, I mean, I don't know. I assume most of your listeners would be familiar with like the Haifa daycare study, or should I go over that?
They might be, but it's a great study, so I would say go for it.
It's a great study. So it's this nice study they were doing in Israel daycare where they said, hey, we have parents picking up their children from daycare late all the time. And just like 10 minutes late, you had to finish an email at work. I think this is the 90s, so it wasn't an email, but that sort of thing. And they said, what we're going to do is we're going to start fining people and saying, hey, if you, don't pick up your kids on time, like it's, $50, something like that. I think even less, like $20. And immediately what happens when you do this is you say, well, this is no longer a friendly, everyone trust everyone else sort of thing. It's now a market transaction. And like when you're like, am I willing to spend $20 to stay a little bit later at work? Absolutely. And so like the incentive crowds out the sort of positive feelings that were already in place. And you can think about this with government policies, is that like if you're putting like all these systems in place saying like, okay, we need to verify like why you did this and we're going to be really annoying, but like people are almost, it makes it clear that this isn't a sort of like, oh, we trust you, we're going to let you do it, but it's like something where you're like, okay, this is a system that you should be trying to maximize how you gain it, and trying to figure out how to operationally get as much as you can out of it. And so and again, like I think we don't know how this is going to actually work in practice, but like one of the things that I would really hope to see is something where they say, okay, like let people self-certify. Don't be like, yeah, we're going to, if you self-certify, we're going to be looking up this in 3 months and suing you for back wages if you don't do it. But like trying to actually trust people to that level and communicating it in precisely that way. Like we're having a national crisis, we're all in this together, and we're providing as much support as we can through the federal government right now, but like also saying, hey, we're all in this together and you shouldn't be trying to exploit it. And like that doesn't mean that there are bad people out there in the world that would be trying to exploit it. But like I think the magnitudes of how many of those people are and how much the cost of the system is quite small versus the huge disruptions of making people fill out paperwork for weeks and not actually get the supports that they need.
Yeah, it's interesting. Like it's almost like, to the way you said that, and there's this concern about people like cheating the system, and that's sort of like a natural thing to maybe gravitate to. It's just like, oh, we need to give it to qualified people because we want to make sure that the resources are going to the right people. But like you said, it's sort of non-intuitive. It has kind of the opposite effect in a lot of ways. And I think this situation is actually particularly unique because a lot of why we're doing this is because we don't want people to work. The whole goal of this is that for a public health purpose, we need people to not be going to work. We need people to be staying home away from others, and all the friction that you add in there, and any sort of like, the other thing is like, there's this hidden cost of like what the bureaucracy or the missed opportunities of people that don't pursue the benefit because of those. And in all likelihood, there's going to be people that do, manipulate the system, but they're probably a very small fraction where the cost of trying to identify them just isn't worth the potential payoff of people getting that money, putting that money back into the economy, paying the rent on time, stuff like that.
Yeah, exactly. And the other thing I'll add, and this is mostly our folks on the international side who've done work on this, but like it's sort of interesting. Like, so we're doing these like $1,200 checks in the United States, which like we do not have the infrastructure to do, but like that's actually a really common social support in a lot of developing countries. And so we've been actually doing a lot of work on that. And it is interesting because like you can actually be just as effective in changing people's behavior by doing like a messaging add-on where you say like, hey, here is some money and this is what we suggest you spend the money on. We suggest you spend this money on food. We suggest you spend this money on education for your kids. And it's sort of funny, like there's actual findings that have been done in those countries which says that actually is more effective than requiring it, right? So like if you say, give everybody money and then have, a reminder at the front being like, this is for your kids' education. No, like people are like, okay, this is for my kids' education. Like they're not jerks to their kids, especially. Whereas if you say,
it's kind of like mental accounting, putting in the buckets, right?
Exactly. Whereas you say, okay, here's some money, like, and in order to get this money, we require that you send us documentation that your kid was in school. Like that actually has often worse effects than the messaging by itself. So it's definitely a place you can use behavioral science to make these systems more effective.
Yeah, I would assume also that like countries are particularly well positioned to accentuate or just kind of like highlight this relational messaging, or like identity-based messaging where like being a citizen is oftentimes like kind of a very like strongly held identity. And I mean, it's a great point that like forcing people into this sort of transactional mindset is probably like a downside. It's interesting though that part of the reason maybe why some of these things are changing is just because people have to make these decisions so quickly. Policymakers have to make decisions really quickly, and these things have to be kind of like turned on a dime. And yeah, like some of these systems were built in like the 1960s or 1950s, right? So, what have you either observed or kind of what are your thoughts on just how policymakers can make these decisions, with the speed that they have or with the limited time that they have?
Yeah, and I'll say like, there's policymaker folks and there's administrator folks, right? So like if you're saying policymakers, like I think like I'm naturally sort of gravitating to like what is the language of like the bills going through the Senate and going through the House, and then there's like the actual people on the ground who are making the decisions and providing sort of guidance about it. I don't know. I think, like you said, like one of the big things here is like the need to be able to respond fast. And so I think, one thing that's happening a lot of is like, there are some people who have, plans that they've been developing for years and saying, okay, like let's do this plan. Like it's not necessarily the perfect plan for this situation, but like it's something we have in place. So like a lot of the unemployment things that we just talked about, like that's coming from Michael Bennett, who's a senator from Colorado who was running for president, never got more than 1% in any polls, but like kind of had focused on like unemployment insurance reform as one of his major planks. Unemployment insurance reform not going to get you the attention of more than 1% of the Democratic primary probably, but sort of had like some stuff and some language ready to go on these sorts of issues. So I think that's part of it. So I think it is like, can we take systems that are in place and use them? I think there's also like, there's interesting stuff about like just, looking at what other countries are doing and what's been effective. So like one of the things that, the United States has like unemployment insurance, right? That's our major sort of, how do we cope with a recession safety net? And it's interesting in that like there's other countries, so like Denmark and Germany, which have other systems like work sharing or like things where they say, hey, the government's going to subsidize your payroll costs for companies. And we do not really, we don't have institutions like that in the United States as it is right now. But like some of the stuff that we have that are in the bill are based around that. But I think it is just like one of those things where it is like, it's just such a dynamic sort of thing that people are making decisions pretty quickly, and trying to, trying to absorb all the information. I know like, I'm interested in like a lot of these provisions, and like I think last weekend like 5 different texts of like the web of the CARES Act came out, and you're like reading them, and like everyone sort of was like reading them and fact checking them and being like, aha, you need to change, section 4 paragraph 3 sentence 14. And some of that actually did get to policymakers via the sort of lots of people looking at it and finding the bugs.
Yeah, well, so I mean, I think that's a really valuable distinction to make, though, between the people who are like writing like the bills and then the administrators and the civil servants that are enacting these things, who, yeah, I would imagine typically know much more about sort of the limits of kind of the mechanisms that we have in place and potentially like have kind of creative ideas of ways that these things could be used or improved. Is the process that you just described kind of the either maybe not the best way, but is that sort of what you've seen happening in terms of how that feedback mechanism works?
I honestly don't know. Yeah, I haven't seen enough of it to say it. Again, and I'll say like there's sort of what I see is like there's definitely the people who are the researchers who are saying, hey, this is what we're seeing, this is what we're aggregating up from the administrative folks. And I hope that that's getting to policymakers, right? And I think it is to some extent. But like it's definitely, it's not that they're just like going being like, aha, what are people talking about in these cases? It's a much looser connection than that. I do think that like, one of the a lot of these things is there's this big difference between like how policy folks and how like the on the ground folks see these things. So like, again, unemployment insurance, like, you can go and say, we're opening up unemployment insurance and we're making it much more easy for people to get to. But one of the things that's been happening is that unemployment insurance websites are crashing because they've never had these many people logging onto them. And, the ability to sort of like, hopefully that's something that's solvable. Like you get some more server from Amazon or whatever, some cloud computing things. Even like 3 or 4 days of missing that, or just people just like trying to call and reach these things is such a big hassle. And like I have no idea how much this is happening from a non-anecdotal perspective, but like you can go on Twitter and just be like, yeah, like I've been on the hold with the unemployment insurance company or not division for 6 hours and no one is getting to me and their website is down. And like, again, like going back to the point we talked about earlier, like if you're a person who just lost your job, it's April 2nd. So like you probably rent is due and you're like trying to figure these things out. The system just not responsive to you in the time scales that you need it to be in, which means that like, you're going to have to do other things, right? You're going to have to borrow from friends or family, talk to your landlord and try to get them to push back stuff. But like and that's going to be often like a more fruitful way of spending your energy than trying to like actually qualify for the social supports we have available.
Yeah, it's almost, you kind of remember a lot of things in government are sort of designed to move slowly, like, sort of intentionally, but now is not the time. That's necessarily the best asset. In some ways that's good, in a lot of ways. So yeah, in some ways maybe we have to just like temper our expectations that there's only so much, given this situation, there's only so much that can change so fast, and maybe cut some people a little bit of slack for that in some kind of ways rather than judge everything in absolute terms.
Yeah. No, I mean, it's so funny, the unemployment thing, which is adding $600 again, because they don't know how to do it any other way.
Constraints
like,
you would not have guessed. Yeah.
It's just really interesting. And, there's a lot of people thinking about like this right now, because like that means that if you're someone earning, near minimum wage right now, you're probably going to earn more over the next few weeks if you're on unemployment than you would if your job is staying open. And that's maybe good. Like we want to encourage some jobs to like close and maybe not fire everybody, but furlough their workers and say, okay, we're going to close the next month and we'll
be able to pay their rent comfortably and stuff.
Yeah. But like we're getting a sort of interesting natural experiment on how that works.
Yeah. So we're coming up a little on our time. I think, we had one last thing we'd wanted to discuss at the end, which is, getting a little off specifically the economic aspect. How does behavioral science generally, where can we contribute to this whole thing? I think we were all talking a little bit before we started recording here, and that, this is a tough situation. And in a lot of ways, it seems like, I think behavioral science has interesting perspectives, but there's probably limited impact it can have, at least in the early terms, and we really want to kind of defer to the experts. And we also learned before this that you have some firsthand experience with epidemiology and that you're married to an epidemiologist.
Yeah.
You probably have so you have good perspective and from a few different worlds here. But
And it's interesting because like I think everyone's getting this like crash course in epidemiology, and I think one thing is it's so hard.
Yeah, I'm curious how many people knew what R naught was until like a month ago.
Yeah, exactly. And so like my wife's an infectious disease epidemiologist, but doesn't work on influenza, and so like knows like sort of is pretty conscious of like her limitations there. Whereas I'm like, oh, I've read this person's Medium post and this is what I think now. The philosophical approach that I have for behavioral science broadly is like, I come from an econ perspective. And I actually think like the rational actor model of economics is actually quite good. Like, and it's sort of funny. I end up defending it a lot of the time because people often don't give it the credit that it's for, which is a little bit, out of place for me being a person who primarily works in behavioral economics. But like, it is something where, you say, okay, we know about, here's the systems that we know from economics or anything like that. And then say, okay, what are the specific narrow ways that a behavioral insight can help you do this? Think about this, right? So like, I've been pushing really hard on, thinking about the social safety net, because that's something that I've been thinking about from a behavioral science perspective. And like, there are specific things that we know about how you can crowd out social incentives with fees or monetary incentives, how people are hyperbolic discounters and will put off small tasks like doing that, and like I think that can add a lot. In terms of epidemiology, like I think one of the things that I'm super curious about is like people are trying to figure out, okay, what do we actually do? And the CDC and WHO are doing recommendations, and like there's a level which there's a tension between like trying to just trust the experts and then also saying, okay, do we think about this for ourselves? Like I know one thing I've been really resisting getting involved in is like a lot of people are saying, hey, we should actually all be wearing masks, and maybe we should. Like I'm not sure about that, but like the CDC and the WHO have been sort of recommending that people do not do that. And like one of the things I'm not sure where to come down on this dispute. I don't, but like one thing I've been thinking about is like mask is one of those things. I'm like, intuitively mask totally should work. But I'm like, my intuitions about like what a virus, like what's going to stop a nanometer sized virus from getting into my respiratory system are probably not good. Like I'm not sure that like that means what, we shouldn't wear masks or anything like that. But it's one of those things. I'm like, yeah, like I would find the idea of like the masks being like, oh, everyone should just wear a mask and that'll solve like the problems or reduce it substantially. I find that idea incredibly intuitive and compelling. And like one thing is I'm like, oh, if it's intuitive and compelling, that doesn't actually mean that it's true.
It could be a warning sign in some ways.
And it could be a warning sign. And like, and so it's like hard to so say, like when you say, okay, like, do you trust these sort of recommendations when they feel unintuitive? I'm a little bit more willing to say, like, be like, okay, I might not know stuff that I think that I know, and other things. I remember even like the first couple of weeks of this, it was like, it's so funny because like we went into quarantine so fast. And, like beginning of March, I was like, hey, I've got a convening in late March. Maybe I should delay it, a couple of weeks. And then I was like, okay, yeah, we're definitely delaying it. And then I literally like, I like the last sort of day I saw like anyone outside of my like immediate nuclear family was like, I was like, well, see you guys tomorrow. And then I'm like, okay, we're like the next day we all shut down. I think like the other thing is like the which is maybe hopefully no longer relevant, is like how unintuitive exponential curves are. And there's a great paper, I can't remember the name of it. I'll send it to you guys. But like it's just like they're so unintuitive, and like it's really hard to account for that. And it's so funny that so much of this stuff is just like, oh yeah, like we're going to continue on the exponential curve that we've been on for the last couple of weeks. And like, you should be able to foresee that and be like, okay, this is what's going to be happening next week. But like, you're sort of not mentally able to make that jump, and again, like we had like 1,000 deaths yesterday in the United States or nearly that. And like no one, which again, like if you look at the curve, it's like this very smooth exponential curve. But at the same time, people weren't ready to do that. And like still, like I am not emotionally able to deal with like what that curve suggests is going to be happening next week or a month from now. But like it's at least a possibility that we should be accounting for.
Yeah, for sure. The mask one is actually a really good example of that, because there's, that's been the big thing, at least on Twitter for the last few days. It's like, everybody should wear a mask, and like they're lying to us, and it's like, well, I don't know. It's like obviously a complicated scenario. Like, and I think like the distinction is just like, there's certain things if you feel more comfortable doing something. Like I've been wearing sort of like a homemade mask just because to me, I'm like, there's kind of, as long as I'm not taking one that a medical professional thing, there's really no downside to it. It makes me feel a little bit better. I'm also not going to go run around telling everyone that this is what you have to be doing. Just I'll make my personal choice. So I think in the bigger things, we should defer the people that, are spending all of their time on this and have spent their whole life working on this. And then, for some little things like that, if it makes you feel a little bit better, it doesn't hurt anybody else or affect anybody else's, then, you can make your own decisions in that way. But don't take your own personal decisions and biases and turn that into a broad recommendation that is not super well thought out.
No, I'm the same way. I'm sort of become I've been radicalized to be an anti-mask person by Twitter disputes, which is not a good reason to have any decisions. But the same thing. I basically do wear my winter bike mask when I'm at the grocery store because it makes me feel safer. I have no idea if it's doing anything. But the CDC recommendations, I think those have been the recommendations for years. So it definitely feels like it's something where they might be wrong because of the current situation, because of asymptotic distribution being more
symptoms,
than previous ones. But and it could be I think there's a very good argument that they didn't adapt to that fast enough. But I think there's a lot of conspiracy thinking where there's they did something that I don't think they would have. If you can go to archive.org and look at their website in 2014 and they're still making the same recommendations.
An easily disprovable theory.
Yeah.
Cool. So I think we're about our time here. Zarak, do you have any last questions you want to throw out?
No, this was great.
Yeah, thanks so much for joining us. And I know this is a little bit of short notice and fit into a busy schedule, especially for people that have kids at home and stuff.
Totally happy to join. Really happy to do this. And we have a busy schedule, but also a not busy schedule because
it's a weird combination.
We're in this sort of no time. Thanks for having me on. Great talking, guys.
Yeah, and before we jump off here, just where can people keep in touch with you, follow your work? I know you just had a really good piece in the Behavioral Scientist.
So I'm on Twitter at Best Trousers. So that's a Henry Ibsen reference, which is kind of out of date.
I've actually always wondered what the meaning of your Twitter handle.
It's from a play he did. Actually, it's about a pandemic. I should reread it. But one of the scientists says at one point, you should never wear your best trousers when fighting for truth and justice. And so you can read there, and I'm also be putting out a lot of content and stuff like that at Ideas 42 as well.
Awesome. Well, we'll link to all that stuff in the show notes here, and we will get this out soon. And thanks again for lending your expertise on short notice here. And good luck with quarantine. Stay safe out there, and hopefully we'll talk to you soon.
Thank you. Bye.
All right.
Thank you for listening. That concludes this edition of Action Design Radio, hosted by Eric Johnson and Zarak Khan. All podcast episodes are available on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, YouTube, and many other platforms where you might typically get your pod on. And don't forget to follow us on Facebook and Twitter. Special thanks to Morgan Bortz for design, and as always, we would like to recognize Steve Wendell, founder of the Action Design Network, a nonprofit organization dedicated to spreading awareness about behavioral economics, psychology, and all things behavioral science in order to help you improve your life, your career, and your understanding of the world around us and the people in it. I am your producer and audio engineer, Zach Simon. For more cutting-edge behavioral science content, visit action-design.org. Once again, that's action-design.org. There, you can sign up for our newsletter and find an in-person event happening near you. We have chapters in over a dozen cities in the United States and Canada. Also, on our website, you can find additional notes and links regarding the topics discussed in today's episode. Thank you again for tuning in, and we will see you again soon.